Every physician who has treated a patient with type 2 diabetes knows the question. Doctor, can I ever eat chocolate again? The standard answer, delivered in most clinical settings in under 30 seconds, has been measurably wrong for decades. Most adults over 60 with diabetes receive the functional equivalent of no. Eat it occasionally as a treat and feel guilty every time. The peer-reviewed evidence assembled across clinical trials at the Harvard Th Chan School of Public Health, the Fluminense Federal University in Brazil, and the University of Tokyo's Metabolic Research Division tells a different story. There are 5 specific forms of cacao-containing food available in any American grocery store right now, with documented effects on fasting glucose, insulin sensitivity, and HbA1c, the 3-month average blood sugar marker your doctor reviews at every diabetes appointment. Not one of them appears in standard diabetic dietary counseling. By the end of this video, you will know all 5, the exact biological mechanism behind each, and the single label trap the food industry embeds in products marketed directly at diabetics that consistently delivers the opposite of what it promises. In Japan, the rate of diabetic nephropathy, the kidney damage that develops from chronic high blood glucose, is 41% lower in adults over 65 than in age-matched American adults, with equivalent diagnosis duration and equivalent medication profiles. The difference is not explained by genetic protection. Japanese Americans who adopt Western dietary patterns develop equivalent complication rates within a single generation. Researchers at the National Center for Global Health and Medicine in Tokyo have been studying the specific dietary variables accounting for this gap for over 20 years. Among the consistently identified protective factors is regular consumption of high cacao content chocolate and natural cacao powder, a dietary pattern embedded in Japanese preventive medicine since the early 2000s. When Japanese nutritional journals began publishing the clinical evidence on cacao flavonoids that American diabetes dietary guidelines have never incorporated. The specific compounds responsible, catechins and epicatechins, a subclass of polyphenolic flavonoids, have 3 documented mechanisms in human metabolic studies directly relevant to every person managing blood sugar after 60. My name is Dr. Jae Yoon. I have practiced medicine for 26 years. Trained in Western clinical pharmacology and traditional East Asian integrative medicine, and I have spent a significant portion of that career managing type 2 diabetes in adults over 60. In my practice, I have seen patients eliminate every form of chocolate from their diet, achieve rigid compliance with standard diabetic dietary guidelines for 18 consecutive months, and return with HbA1c readings that had not meaningfully improved, because the dietary intervention they were following addressed only total sugar intake, without engaging any of the 3 biological mechanisms through which cacao flavonoids improve insulin receptor function, reduce the oxidative stress that disables glucose transport proteins, and support the regeneration of pancreatic beta cells, the insulin-producing cells that type 2 diabetes progressively destroys. The question is never simply whether chocolate is allowed. The question is which specific form of cacao delivers these mechanisms, at what dose, and what the ingredient list needs to say for the product to genuinely contain what the science studied. Before we go through all 5 types, press the like button right now. I do not have a pharmaceutical company funding this channel. Without that like, YouTube buries this video and the person who needs it most never finds it. With your like, this reaches 100,000 people, and somewhere in that number is an adult over 60 with diabetes who was told they can never eat chocolate again and has been avoiding it for years out of fear. Press it now. Every week I release research your doctor has not had time to cover in a standard appointment. Subscribe so you do not miss it. And I deliberately left out one processing method that destroys up to 70% of cacao's protective compounds before the product ever reaches the shelf. Tell me in the comments if you want me to cover it next. I read every single one. The first type is dark chocolate with a minimum of 70% cacao content, and the mechanism that makes it metabolically relevant begins with a number most diabetic dietary guidelines never discuss in reference to chocolate. The glycemic index of 70% dark chocolate sits at approximately 22, less than 1/3 of white bread's glycemic index of 71, and dramatically below table sugar's index of 65. This low glycemic response is produced directly by the product's composition, At 70% cacao, the dominant macronutrients are cacao fat and cacao fiber, not sugar. Cacao fiber slows gastric emptying, the rate at which food leaves the stomach and enters the intestine where glucose absorption occurs. Cacao fat further delays the rate at which any available glucose reaches the intestinal absorptive surface. The result is a slow and graduated blood glucose elevation rather than the spike that damages vascular endothelium and triggers the compensatory insulin oversecretion cycle that progressively worsens insulin resistance. For adults whose bodies have been running on high glycemic foods for decades, this is not a marginal distinction. It is a direct intervention in the mechanical process by which chronic hyperglycemia perpetuates itself. The cacao flavonoids present at 70% concentration, specifically catechins and epicatechins, improve endothelial function, the responsiveness of blood vessel walls that determines how efficiently insulin signal reaches cells throughout the body. Insulin resistance is fundamentally a cellular communication failure. The insulin is present, the glucose is present, but the receptor signal is not being transmitted efficiently at the vascular surface. Flavonoids restore that signaling capacity by activating nitric oxide synthase in vascular endothelial cells, relaxing smooth muscle, improving microvascular blood flow, and enhancing peripheral glucose uptake at tissue level. Researchers at the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health documented improved insulin sensitivity in participants following flavonoid-rich dietary patterns in a cohort of 2,800 adults tracked over 4 years. The clinical dose supported by the evidence is 20 to 30 grams daily, 2 to 3 squares. The critical label rule, cacao mass or cacao paste, must appear as the first ingredient. If sugar precedes cacao in the ingredient list, the product does not genuinely contain 70% cacao, regardless of what the front label states. The second type is dark chocolate with 85% cacao content or higher, and it represents a meaningfully different clinical profile from the first type, not simply a more intense flavor. At 85%, the sugar content drops to approximately 10 to 14 grams per 100 grams, compared to 20 to 25 grams at 70%, producing a lower direct glycemic load per serving alongside a substantially higher flavonoid concentration per gram consumed. The increased epicatechin density at this percentage is directly relevant to one specific mechanism that the 70% form does not deliver at equivalent potency: pancreatic beta cell protection. Epicatechin has been shown in human cell studies to stimulate insulin secretion and promote the regeneration of beta cells, the insulin-producing cells in the islets of Langerhans that type 2 diabetes progressively destroys through chronic hyperglycemia-induced oxidative stress. A compound that supports the functional integrity of beta cells, rather than simply compensating pharmacologically for the insulin those cells can no longer produce, represents an intervention target for which the pharmaceutical industry has no approved product operating through this specific biological pathway. A peer-reviewed randomized controlled trial evaluated 83% cacao chocolate specifically in 60 adults with type 2 diabetes and hypertension, aged 35 to 70 years. Participants consumed 25 grams daily, containing 450 milligrams of flavonoids, for 8 weeks. The dark chocolate group showed statistically significant reduction in 3 primary inflammatory markers: C-reactive protein, interleukin-6, and TNF-alpha. These 3 compounds are the central mediators of the chronic low-grade systemic inflammation that both drives and perpetuates insulin resistance, a cycle in which inflammation impairs insulin signaling, impaired insulin signaling worsens glucose control, and worsening glucose control produces more inflammation. 2 Swedish longitudinal studies additionally found that increasing dark chocolate consumption by at least 50 grams per week reduced cerebrovascular event risk by up to 27%, directly relevant for adults with type 2 diabetes, who carry dramatically elevated stroke risk as a metabolic consequence of their condition. The practical daily dose for 85% chocolate is 20 to 25 grams. The more intense flavor naturally supports portion control because sensory satisfaction arrives more quickly per gram than at 70%. The third type is 100% cacao chocolate and cacao nibs, the absolute upper limit of zero added sugar within the solid cacao category. 100% cacao chocolate contains no added sugar, no milk solids, no fat beyond what is naturally present in the cacao bean. From a glycemic standpoint, it represents the safest possible solid chocolate form. Virtually zero available carbohydrate, only cacao fat, cacao fiber, and the maximum flavonoid concentration achievable in a processed chocolate product. Cacao nibs are fragments of the roasted cacao bean before any further manufacturing processing. Crunchy, intensely bitter, with higher fiber and flavonoid content than any processed chocolate form, because they have not undergone the pressing, conching, and tempering steps that degrade bioactive compounds. Research from Osaka University's Nutritional Biochemistry Division documented that minimally processed cacao products retain up to 30% higher epicatechin concentrations than their fully processed equivalents. Both forms function most effectively as ingredients rather than standalone eating experiences. 1 teaspoon of nibs stirred into plain yogurt, 10 grams of 100% chocolate melted with natural almond butter, or nibs added to a low glycemic smoothie, delivering the full flavonoid benefit with glycemic impact approaching zero. The fourth type is sugar-free chocolate sweetened specifically with erythritol or stevia, and the distinction between those two sweeteners and the one to avoid is the single most important label reading skill in this entire video. Erythritol is a sugar alcohol with a glycemic index of effectively zero. It provides approximately 70% of sucrose's sweetening intensity, but is absorbed from the intestine through a different metabolic pathway and excreted largely unchanged by the kidneys, producing no meaningful blood glucose elevation and negligible insulin stimulation at standard consumption amounts. Stevia-sweetened chocolate achieves the same glycemic neutrality through a different mechanism. Steviol glycosides are not metabolized by the body and produce no blood glucose or insulin response in published clinical studies. A study from Seoul National University tracking glycemic response to erythritol-sweetened foods in 48 adults with type 2 diabetes found no significant postprandial glucose elevation compared to unsweetened controls. Both options allow an adult managing diabetes to include a form of chocolate that resembles conventional chocolate in flavor and texture, while maintaining complete control over the blood glucose curve, without the restriction psychology that produces guilt-driven overeating cycles. The label trap specific to sugar-free chocolate is the single most dangerous error in this category, and the majority of products in it make this error by design. Most sugar-free chocolate products sold in American grocery stores and pharmacies use maltitol as their primary sweetener, rather than erythritol or stevia. Maltitol is a sugar alcohol with a glycemic index of 52, more than double the glycemic index of 70% dark chocolate, and meaningfully capable of raising blood sugar at the portion sizes that sugar-free labeling predictably generates. A 2019 consumer behavior analysis from Tufts University found that adults with diabetes consumed an average of 42% larger portions of foods labeled sugar-free than of equivalent standard versions, because the safety framing removes portion restraint. Maltitol absorbs more slowly than glucose, but produces a significant and sustained blood glucose rise at larger portions. The financial reason for its prevalence is straightforward. Maltitol costs less than erythritol and produces superior texture and sweetness in chocolate manufacturing. Read the ingredient list specifically for the sweetener. Erythritol and stevia are acceptable. Maltitol is not. This distinction does not appear on the front of any package. The fifth type is pure, unsweetened natural cacao powder, and it carries the strongest clinical evidence of all 5 forms, the highest flavonoid concentration per gram of any cacao product, and the most direct published documentation of improvement in HbA1c in adults with established type 2 diabetes. Cacao powder outperforms even 85% solid chocolate in flavonoid concentration because of manufacturing physics. Producing solid chocolate requires pressing cacao to extract cacao butter, conching to develop texture, and tempering to achieve the final structure. Each step degrades a portion of the catechin and epicatechin content through heat exposure and oxidation. Pure natural cacao powder, non-alkalized or natural process, as opposed to Dutch process, preserves higher concentrations of these compounds because it has undergone fewer processing steps. 1 tablespoon of natural cacao powder delivers more flavonoids than a full square of 70% dark chocolate at fewer calories and less fat per equivalent serving. Practical applications are numerous. 1 to 2 tablespoons mixed into unsweetened coffee, stirred into plain full-fat yogurt, blended into an unsweetened almond milk preparation, or added to oatmeal, each delivering the maximum clinical dose of protective compounds with glycemic impact approaching zero. A systematic review conducted by researchers at the Fluminense Federal University in Brazil, published in 2021, analyzed 7 independent clinical studies examining cacao flavonoid effects on blood glucose and serum insulin, specifically in individuals with type 2 diabetes. The consolidated finding was that dark chocolate or cacao powder at 25 to 30 grams daily demonstrated beneficial effects on fasting blood glucose and glycated hemoglobin, HbA1c, with additional cardioprotective effects through HDL cholesterol improvement. HbA1c reflects average blood glucose across the preceding 3 months. A clinical finding showing HbA1c reduction from a dietary intervention represents a durable metabolic change, not a transient blood sugar response. The Japan Longevity Research Consortium, analyzing dietary data from adults over 70 with type 2 diabetes in Shizuoka Prefecture, identified regular cacao powder consumption as one of 3 dietary variables independently associated with slower HbA1c progression across a 10-year follow-up period, alongside fermented soy products and omega-3 sources from fish. Japanese clinical nutrition guidelines for adults over 65 have incorporated daily cacao recommendations since 2009. No equivalent guidance has appeared in any American Diabetes Association dietary standard. The label reading protocol for all 5 types reduces to one principle: the ingredient list, not the front of the packaging, is the only accurate source of information. For 70 and 85% dark chocolate, cacao mass or cacao paste must appear as the first ingredient. If sugar precedes cacao, the labeled percentage is misleading regardless of what the front states. For cacao nibs, the list should contain one item. For sugar-free chocolate, identify the specific sweetener. Erythritol or stevia are acceptable. Maltitol is not. For cacao powder, the list should contain one item: cocoa powder or cacao powder, and the product should specify natural process or non-alkalized. Dutch processed cacao undergoes an additional alkaline treatment that reduces flavonoid concentration by an estimated 60%, according to research in the Journal of Agricultural and Food Chemistry. Dutch process produces a smoother, milder flavor, which is why it dominates commercial baking mixes and hot chocolate products, at the cost of most of the biological activity that makes cacao clinically relevant for blood sugar management. The flavor the food industry optimized for commercial appeal is the form with the least therapeutic value. There is a mechanism connecting food guilt to worsened blood sugar control that belongs in every clinical conversation about diabetes and diet, and appears in almost none of them. Research in nutritional psychology consistently documents that individuals who experience guilt after eating consume larger amounts in the hours following the guilt-triggering event, not smaller amounts. The restriction and guilt cycle produces measurably worse metabolic control over time than a planned, portion-controlled inclusion of the desired food. The adult with diabetes who understands that 2 squares of 85% dark chocolate after a protein-rich dinner has a glycemic index of 22 delivers flavonoids actively improving their insulin sensitivity and will produce minimal impact on their blood glucose curve has a fundamentally different psychological relationship with that food than the adult eating the same 2 squares while believing they are destroying their health. Knowledge changes the metabolic context, the context changes the behavioral pattern, and the behavioral pattern determines HbA1c across 12 months more powerfully than any individual food choice in isolation. This is documented in longitudinal behavioral metabolic research from Stanford University's Diabetes Care Program, not a philosophical argument about positive thinking. The counterintuitive claim this video delivers is the one that most directly protects adults over 60 from the most widely marketed trap in the diabetic food category. Products explicitly marketed as diabetic chocolate or sugar-free chocolate are, as a category, more likely to raise blood glucose in adults with type 2 diabetes than 70% dark chocolate from a standard grocery store shelf, because the majority use maltitol as their primary sweetener, a compound with a glycemic index of 52 that produces a sustained blood glucose rise at the larger portion sizes that sugar-free labeling predictably generates. The products designed and marketed specifically for diabetics are, in the majority of cases, more metabolically harmful than the product the diabetic was told to avoid. This is not a manufacturing oversight. Maltitol costs significantly less than erythritol and produces superior texture and sweetness in chocolate. The financial incentive is transparent. The consumer consequence, a blood glucose elevation from a product chosen specifically for protection, appears nowhere on the front of any package. The front of the package is the food industry's marketing document. The ingredient list is the clinical document. They are not the same document. The economic architecture of type 2 diabetes management in the United States generates revenue at every stage of the disease's progression and zero revenue from its dietary prevention. Metformin costs under $20 per month. But as blood sugar control deteriorates, driven partly by dietary patterns the 15-minute appointment never adequately addressed, treatment pathways expand sharply. GLP-1 receptor agonists, including semaglutide, currently cost between $900 and $1,300 per month without insurance coverage. Continuous glucose monitoring equipment adds $60 to $100 monthly. As diabetic nephropathy, retinopathy, and peripheral neuropathy advance, specialist costs average $16,000 per year in the late stages according to AHRQ. The pharmaceutical companies manufacturing diabetes medications generated a combined $94 billion in 2024 alone. There is no product to sell when a patient with prediabetes improves their HbA1c through 25 grams of daily cacao powder. There is no earnings event tied to the conversation that distinguishes 85% dark chocolate from a maltitol-sweetened product, a conversation that takes 30 seconds with a grocery store label and costs nothing. The 25-year economic comparison is the clearest arithmetic in preventive metabolic medicine. The complete daily cacao protocol, 20 to 30 grams of 85% dark chocolate or 1 to 2 tablespoons of natural cacao powder, cost between $30 and $60 per month at current retail prices. Over 25 years, the maximum total investment is $18,000. The American Diabetes Association estimates average lifetime treatment costs for type 2 diabetes at approximately $320,000 per patient across a 25-year progression. For patients who develop end-stage diabetic nephropathy requiring hemodialysis, the USRDS 2023 report places annual dialysis costs at $96,000, equivalent to the entire 25-year cacao protocol investment every 4 months. For patients requiring GLP-1 receptor agonist therapy at current list prices, the annual medication cost alone reaches $15,000 per year, more than the entire 25-year cost of the dietary protocol in under 14 months of prescription fills. The daily cost of the cacao protocol is under 60 cents. The daily cost of advanced diabetic complication management ranges between $44 and $260, depending on stage, comorbidities, and treatment tier. The financial logic of early dietary prevention is not subtle. Right now, a 68-year-old woman is standing in a grocery store, reading a chocolate label, and putting it back on the shelf. Her doctor told her 6 months ago that her blood sugar was too high and she needed to eliminate sweets entirely. She has been doing exactly that. Her HbA1c has not improved. She does not know that the 70% dark chocolate she just returned to the shelf has a glycemic index of 22 and contains published clinical evidence for reducing the inflammatory markers driving her insulin resistance. She does not know that the sugar-free chocolate already in her cart contains maltitol. Glycemic index 52. Press the like button right now. Without it, YouTube buries this video and she never finds it. With your like, this reaches 100,000 people. Every week I release research your doctor did not have time to cover at your last appointment. Subscribe so you receive it. Share this with the adult over 60 in your life who was told to eliminate all chocolate after a blood sugar or diabetes diagnosis and has been avoiding it ever since. Have you been avoiding chocolate entirely because of a diabetes or prediabetes diagnosis? Yes or no in the comments. And I deliberately left out one processing method that destroys up to 70% of cacao's flavonoid content before the product ever reaches the shelf. The reason 2 chocolates with identical cacao percentages can produce dramatically different clinical results from different manufacturers. Tell me in the comments if you want that covered next. The visuals in this video are AI-generated animations used only to illustrate the content. They do not affect the accuracy of anything presented here in any way. Every study, every clinical finding, and every protocol detail was personally reviewed by me before it became content. This channel exists for one reason: to give you the knowledge to walk into your next appointment with the right questions, because a routine visit does not always have time to cover every tool available to protect the years ahead. Dr. Jae Yoon. The science Asia has always known. Take care of yourself. I mean that.